In February 2018, a cold Thursday afternoon in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, the air hangs heavy, the streets carry that familiar mix of workday exhaustion and quiet hope. For 27-year-old Kayana Davis, this day should have felt like a turning point. The day where hard work finally felt worth it, where struggle gave way, even if only for a moment, to the feeling that life might be easing up. Kayana wasn't the woman who took anything for granted. Every dollar mattered. Every shift at Dollar General was a step toward something better. Not for herself, no. Everything Kayana did, every sacrifice, every late-night worry, every early morning push to get out the door was for her daughters. Azela, 6 years old. Olivia, not even 3. They were her reason, her heartbeat. The reason she got up even when her body begged her to lay down for a little longer. The reason she smiled when her spirit felt too tired to pretend. The reason she spent so many nights laying awake, counting every bill, every dollar, trying to make sense of numbers that never seemed to stretch far enough. That Thursday, February 22nd, was supposed to change some of that. Her tax refund had arrived, $3,000. $3,000 she'd already divided up in her head. A few bills could finally get cleared, the girls could get some new clothes, and maybe there'd be enough left over for something that wasn't essential, something that felt like life instead of survival. She told her mom about it, Sheila, the one person who understood how much weight Kayana carried on her shoulders. They'd talked about the future, about moving to Charlotte, a fresh start for all of them, more space, more peace. Kayana had hope again, the hope that made her smile without realizing it, the hope that made her talk about her plans at work with people she thought were friends. Before we get into this heartbreaking case, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. Kayana had no way of knowing that the same excitement she couldn't hold back, the same hope she had shared so openly, would be the very thing that made her a target. She had no way of knowing that someone she laughed with at work, someone who stood a few feet away from her day after day, was listening for reasons that had nothing to do with friendship. This was someone who knew her, someone who knew exactly how much money was coming, someone who knew exactly when her shift would end and exactly which way she'd walk when she stepped out the door. That Thursday wasn't supposed to end in blood. It wasn't supposed to leave her 2 little girls with nothing but memories and a lifetime of questions no child should ever have to ask. $3,000. That's all it took for someone Kayana trusted to see her life as something they could cash out, and by the time the sun set, Kayana's joy, her relief, her hope, had been reduced to $800. What happened to Kayana Davis was more than a robbery. It was more than a murder. It was a betrayal so personal, so deliberate, that even now, years later, it's impossible to understand how anyone could do what they did to her. Before we go any further, we want to take a moment to express our deepest condolences to Kayana Davis's family, her friends, and especially her 2 daughters, Azela and Olivia, who were far too young to lose their mother in such a brutal and senseless way. There are no words that could ever fill the emptiness left behind. No sentence strong enough to capture the pain of knowing someone you love stepped out the door with hope in their heart, only to never make it home. To Kayana's family, we understand your grief, your strength, and your love for her. And to her daughters, we hope that as they grow, they come to understand that their mother's story is not only one of tragedy, but also of love, resilience, and the dreams she carried for them every single day. At Dollar General, where shifts ran long and the pay never seemed to stretch far enough, it was easy for co-workers to become something more. When you spend that much time standing shoulder to shoulder, facing the same long lines, dealing with the same frustrations, it starts to feel like you know the people beside you, even if you only met them when you filled out your first schedule. That's how it was for Kayana Davis and Leah Whitley. They weren't childhood friends, they weren't family, but day after day, shift after shift, they stood beside each other. They joked about the customers who made them roll their eyes, complained about how slow the hours dragged when the store was empty, and traded stories about life outside those automatic doors. It felt like familiarity. It felt like trust. And when Kayana's tax refund finally came through, that trust made it easy for her to share the excitement that had been bubbling inside her for days. $3,000. For some, it might not sound like much, but for Kayana, it meant breathing room. It meant her girls could get some new clothes without her worrying if there'd be enough left for groceries. It meant the overdue bills waiting in that dreaded pile on the table could finally disappear. It meant she could exhale, even if only for a little while. She wasn't someone who bragged. She didn't show off or rub her good news in anyone's face. But when you've been holding your breath for months, maybe years, waiting for something to go right, it's hard not to let that relief spill out, especially when you're standing next to someone you see more often than some of your own family. She talked about her daughters. Azela, 6 years old, already full of questions about everything life could possibly offer, and Alavia, still so young, still needing her mom for every little thing. Every hour Kayanu worked was for them. Every sore muscle, every shift where her feet ached before she even clocked out, it was all for her girls. And now, for the first time in a long time, she felt like they were on the edge of something better. She told Leah about her plans, about how her mom, Sheila, had been thinking about moving to Charlotte. A fresh start, a place where life could feel a little lighter, a place where her daughters could grow up with more than what was right in front of them. That refund wasn't a lottery win, it wasn't going to make them rich, but it was enough to remind Kayana that better days were possible, that her work, her struggle, her hope, all meant something. And because it felt like something worth celebrating, she talked about it. She talked about her plans. She talked about the dresses she wanted to buy her daughters, the groceries she could stock in the fridge without worrying if they'd run out before payday. She talked to the woman standing right next to her, the one she thought was her friend, the one she believed was happy to see her catch a break. When you trust someone you see every day at work, you never think they could be planning your death. You never think the person smiling beside you, the one handing you a register key or covering for you when you run to the bathroom, could be the same person making sure you never make it home. But that's exactly what was happening, even while Kayana was still smiling, still hopeful, still believing her good news was something safe to share. While Kayana was imagining a better life for her daughters, the person standing right beside her at work was imagining something completely different. Leah Whitley wasn't just a co-worker trying to get through another shift. She had her own secrets, her own life outside that store, and it was a life Kayana knew nothing about. When Leah clocked out, she didn't go home to a quiet night or plans for the future. She had someone waiting, Kaijin Xavier Scott. Their relationship wasn't the kind built on love or trust or anything that could hold up when life got hard. It was built on quick schemes, shortcuts, and whatever could get them what they wanted with the least amount of effort. When Kayana's tax refund came through and her excitement started to show, Leah wasn't just listening the way a friend would. She was taking notes in her mind, running through every detail that might matter later. She knew how much money Kayuna had. She knew it was cash. She knew Kayuna didn't drive and would be walking home after work with her purse right there in her hand. Leah didn't keep that information to herself. While Kayana was thinking about her daughters and all the ways that refund could make life a little brighter, Leah was texting Kaijin. Every piece of information was passed along: how much money Kayana was carrying, what time her shift ended, which way she'd walk when she left the store. It wasn't complicated. It didn't need to be. Leah wasn't sending long messages or making any effort to hide what she was doing. It was fast, direct, no hesitation, because in her mind, whatever friendship they had didn't matter nearly as much as the money Kayana was holding. As the day wore on and Kayana's shift ticked closer to the end, Kaijin and his friend Dane Taylor were already moving into place. They weren't strangers to this kind of thing. They knew how to wait. They knew how to watch, and on that cold afternoon they sat in a car parked behind the store, the engine running, their eyes locked on the door Kayana would eventually walk through. Surveillance footage would later capture it all: the car idling, the faces that stayed just out of clear view, the moments where nothing seemed unusual, until everything was. Inside the store, Kayana had no way of knowing that every step she took was already being tracked, that every smile she shared with Leia was being twisted into something ugly behind her back. She had no way of knowing that someone she stood beside for hours, someone she believed was a friend, was handing over her life, piece by piece, in exchange for nothing more than a plan to take what she had worked so hard to earn. Kayana's shift was ending. She gathered her things, said goodbye the way co-workers do at the end of a long day, and stepped out into the air that felt a little lighter now that she had something to hold on to. But what she couldn't see, what no one ever expects, was that the same door she walked through with hope in her heart was the door that led her straight into the hands of the people who had been waiting for her all along. Kayana's shift was finally over. That feeling of relief, the kind you only get after standing on your feet for hours, was mixed with something brighter. Excitement. The kind that comes when you know for once you're heading home with more than the usual exhaustion. She had her money, the money that made all those long shifts, all those late nights worrying about bills, feel like they might have been worth it after all. She stopped by Leia's register before she left, the same way she'd done so many times before. She bought a few things, nothing special, little things she could carry in her bag, the kind of stuff you grab without thinking when you know there's a bit of extra money in your pocket. There was nothing strange about that moment, nothing that would have made her think this was the last time she'd stand on that worn tile floor, the last time she'd hear the beep of her items scanning, the last time she'd exchange words with the woman she believed was her friend. The door slid open and she stepped out into the afternoon air, walking down the same sidewalk she'd taken so many times before. Laketon Avenue wasn't unfamiliar. It wasn't the kind of place where you watched every shadow, where you clutched your purse tighter for no reason at all. It was a path that felt like part of her day, a stretch of pavement that separated work from home. There was no reason to think today would be any different, no reason to glance over her shoulder, no reason to feel anything but the satisfaction of knowing she was heading home with her hard-earned money safe in her purse. But while Kayuna walked, talking to herself in her mind about what she'd cook for dinner or which bill to pay first, the Toyota Corolla was already there. The engine wasn't loud, the doors didn't slam, nothing about it called attention to itself. Kai-Jean was behind the wheel, pretending to check something near the hood, playing the part of someone with car trouble, the kind of harmless inconvenience that wouldn't make anyone nervous. It was all part of the plan, a scene set for a moment Kayana didn't know was waiting for her. Dane Taylor moved fast. There was no warning, no introduction, no time for Kayana to understand what was happening before his hands were on her purse. The bag that held the money she had worked so hard for, the money she'd already imagined spending on her daughters, her mother, her future. She didn't give it up easily. She held on because that's who she was. A mother who knew how much every dollar meant. A woman who had worked too hard for too long to let someone rip it away without a fight. But fights on the sidewalk, between someone who knows what's coming and someone caught completely off guard, are never fair. The gun came out faster than Kayana could process. There was no negotiation, no threat she could talk her way out of. 2 shots broke through the air, shattering every bit of peace the day had left. One bullet tore into her pelvis, cutting through bone and artery, dropping her to the ground with the kind of pain no one can push through. The pavement was cold under her hands as she tried to crawl. Blood soaked through her clothes, her fingers slipping against the concrete as she reached toward nothing but hope that someone would see her. Cars passed. People moved about their day, unaware that a mother lay bleeding, trying to hold on to the life she had built, one hard shift at a time. Every breath was a battle. Every inch she crawled was a desperate plea for help. She didn't know if anyone could see her, if anyone would stop, if the life she fought so hard to hold together was already slipping through her fingers. The car didn't wait. The plan was in motion, and the men who saw her as nothing more than an easy payday had no reason to stay. They had her purse. They had her money. They had no reason to care about the woman they left bleeding on the ground, the woman they knew nothing about, the woman who had given everything for her daughters and would have given more if only life had given her the chance. Kayana's body lay stretched across the sidewalk, her hands trembling against the concrete, her breath uneven as pain overwhelmed every part of her. The blood loss was fast. too fast for her to understand how little time she had. Cars kept passing, faces glanced her way, but not everyone processed what they were seeing. It's easy to miss something that doesn't make sense at first glance. A person on the ground, struggling to move, in a place where people usually walk without a second thought. Finally, someone stopped. Someone saw her, really saw her. The pain in her eyes, the way her body was curled in on itself, her hand reaching toward the sky as if that might somehow stop the bleeding. The call to 911 was made, a call no one ever expects to make, a call where the voice on the other end always sounds too calm compared to what's actually happening right in front of you. First responders arrived fast, but no matter how quickly they moved, they couldn't rewind the minutes that had already slipped away. The gunshot wound wasn't something a bandage could fix. The bullet had torn through her pelvis, cutting into the arteries that carried her life through her body. Blood poured from the wound, soaking into the sidewalk that had once been so familiar. A path she had walked so many times before, never imagining it would be the place where her life slipped away. Paramedics lifted her onto the stretcher, her body limp but still fighting. There was no giving up, there was no surrender. Even with the pain closing in on all sides, she fought. For her daughters, for her mother, for every dream she had ever whispered to herself on nights when it felt like hope was all she had left. At UPMC Presbyterian Hospital, the emergency team worked fast. There was no time for questions, no time for anything but trying to save the life of a woman who had been taken down for no reason other than greed. They saw the entry wound, the damage to her right thigh, the shattered bone, the torn arteries. They saw the black soot, the imprint of the gun's muzzle pressed against her skin when the trigger was pulled. It was close, personal. Not the kind of shot fired from across the street, but the kind where someone stands right over you, leaving no doubt that you aren't supposed to survive. They did everything they could. They pushed back against the clock, trying to buy her more time, trying to hold on to the life slipping away underneath their hands. But the damage was too much. Too many arteries torn apart, too much blood already gone. The call went out across Wilkinsburg. A woman found on the sidewalk, bleeding out from a gunshot wound, barely able to move by the time help arrived. Officers responded fast, the way they always do when life is hanging by a thread, but this wasn't a rescue. By the time they reached her, there was only so much they could do. What started as an emergency response quickly shifted into something else. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't random. This was deliberate, and from the moment officers arrived, they knew someone had followed Kayana's steps, waited for her to leave work, and attacked her before she ever had a chance to fight back. Detectives started where they always do: witness statements. Who saw what? Who heard the gunshots? Who noticed something that felt out of place but didn't make sense until after the fact? People talked about the car, the Toyota Corolla. It didn't belong to anyone in the neighborhood, but it was there long enough to catch attention. Security cameras from nearby businesses filled in some of the gaps. There it was, the Corolla, sitting in the back parking lot of Dollar General before Kayana ever stepped outside. License plate recognition connected the car to someone, but not to the men inside it. The car belonged to Kaijin Scott's mother, a detail that would open the door detectives needed to walk through. When officers found Kaijin, his story came fast. Too fast. He wasn't involved, he said. He was just a jitney driver, picking up fares to make some extra money, and Dane was the one who had the problem, not him. But words mean less when the facts are already stacking up, and Kaijin's words didn't match the facts that were already sitting in front of detectives. Phone records, the quiet evidence that never lies, started connecting the threads no one could see from the outside. There were calls between Kaijin and Leia, calls before Kayuna left work, calls while she was still inside the store, calls that didn't fit any explanation Kaijin tried to offer. Leia's number appeared again and again, her phone in constant communication with the men waiting outside. Every excuse Kaijin gave started to crumble under the weight of what detectives were piecing together, and what began as a robbery investigation slowly twisted into something even uglier. When detectives pulled the Dollar General work schedule, there was Leia's name right beside Kayana's, working the same shift, side by side, the same way they had been so many times before. That connection alone wasn't enough to prove anything, but detectives were already working ahead. Leia's phone was pulled, her messages reviewed, and there it was. The conversations with Kaijin, time-stamped texts sent while Kayana was still smiling, still working, still talking about the life she was trying to build for her daughters. Messages with no hesitation, no regret. Exact times, exact movements, exactly when Kayana left the store, exactly which way she was walking, exactly how much money was in her purse. Leia's arrest wasn't loud or dramatic. There was no scene, there was no fight. In the interrogation room, she sat across from detectives who already knew more than she thought they did. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of her own words. Words she had sent without thinking they would ever be seen by anyone outside her small circle. At first, she denied everything. There was no plan, no setup, no connection. But as the questions kept coming, the truth pressed down on her. There was nowhere left to hide. Kaijin's story had already started to shift, and once the text messages were laid out in front of her, once detectives showed her every word she had sent, her denials started to crack. Kayana Davis didn't get to go home that day. She didn't get to walk through the door with her paycheck safely tucked inside her purse. She didn't get to cook dinner for her daughters, or sit on the couch for a few minutes of quiet after another long shift. Her life ended on a sidewalk she had walked so many times before. The same sidewalk where her blood stained the concrete, and strangers stood helpless, watching a life slip away. But the story didn't end there. Detectives followed every thread, pulled every piece together until the truth stood clear in front of them. Kayona's life was taken because of 3 people, and every one of them would eventually answer for what they did. Kaijin Xavier Scott, the man who drove the car, who waited with the engine running, who knew exactly why they were there and exactly what was going to happen, was convicted of second-degree murder, robbery, conspiracy, and evidence tampering. He didn't pull the trigger, but the weight of every decision he made that day pressed down on him inside that courtroom. Every mile he drove, every moment he sat there waiting for the sound of gunshots, made him just as guilty as the man who held the gun. And in those quiet moments, when the house is silent and the girls are asleep, Sheila sits alone with the weight of knowing that the danger didn't come from a stranger on a dark corner. It came from someone who stood close enough to know the names of her grandchildren. Someone who stood close enough to hear every hope Kayana carried in her heart. Someone who smiled at her across the store and asked how her day was going, all while texting the men who would be waiting for her outside. Greed doesn't care about friendship. It doesn't care about loyalty or trust or history. It tears through everything in its path, leaving nothing but broken pieces for the people left behind to pick up. And when that greed comes from someone you thought you knew, someone you thought was safe, it's a kind of loss no words can fully explain. Kayana Davis should be alive today. She should be watching her daughters grow, planning her future, building the life she dreamed of with her mother by her side. But instead, her story lives here, a reminder that the people closest to you can be the ones watching for the moment you're most vulnerable. A reminder that betrayal doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it comes from the person standing right beside you. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think about how fragile trust can be and how quickly life can change, we want to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from and how Kayona's story made you feel. Stories like this are more than just headlines. They are real lives, real families, real people who carried dreams, struggles, and hopes. People who deserved so much more than the way their stories ended. We also want to hear from you in a more personal way. Have you ever trusted someone only to find out that trust was nothing more than an open door for them to hurt you? Maybe it was a friend, a coworker, someone you believed was in your corner, only to realize they were standing close enough to know exactly where to cut. If you've ever felt that kind of betrayal, share your experience. Let others know they aren't alone. And if you were in Kayana's situation, if you were someone just trying to get through your day, excited about the chance to breathe a little easier after a hard stretch of life, what would you have done? Would you have trusted the people around you to celebrate with you? Would you have thought twice about who you shared your excitement with? Or would you have done exactly what Kayana did? Believed that the people who stood beside you were safe. Your thoughts matter. Your voice matters. So let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, stories that dig deeper than the headlines and remind us all how much one decision can change everything, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are so many stories out there. Stories of trust broken, lives shattered, and families left to pick up pieces no one should ever have to hold. Together, we can keep their names alive and make sure they are never forgotten. Thank you for watching. Until next time,